Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dyslexic Life Hacks Show. I'm your host, Matthew Head. And in this episode, I'm talking to Cassandra Roulette-May. She's the director of Roulette Ed. This provides one-to-one tuition for students of 5 to 17 years of age who find learning very challenging. She was formerly a teacher working in Essex, mostly in primary schools, in front of class, as well as helping students with learning difficulties. As always, I will put the show notes and links at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, Cassandra.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you, Matthew.
Excellent. So what I wanted to kick off with really is your teaching career, because this is something really spiked my interest about you, is that actually you probably struggled in the school system and then decided to join it from the other side of the fence. So how did you think, I really want to be a teacher?
I think it was really early on, actually. So my initial schooling, I went to a small private school, and we were diagnosed early if the head teachers thought that there might be a learning need. I was one of those, and subsequently got a lot of one-to-one help. And it kind of spurred me on to think, well, if I had that help, but I had these needs, then there'll be other people like me. So I kind of, the principals, the head teachers of the school were my inspiration. And I kind of got focused on that from about 9, I think. And I didn't waver wanting to be a teacher after that. So I went through the secondary school system and onwards, taking slightly different paths in my education because I was finding learning challenging, but got to university and I managed to get my teaching degree, and then find I was living in Essex and went to a school in London to do my year of QTS, and stayed within primary education for quite a long time. And that stayed with me, that need to support children and to think of learning more creatively. And then the system is on occasion difficult to work with. One of the schools I worked in, I wasn't allowed to say that I was dyslexic. So I could say that I understood, but it meant that I couldn't really explain why I knew what was going on. So that was kind of one of the hurdles that made me kind of start to change. And then I became a Senko. So I could then say that I had this thing, and I understood where children were coming from. And even though all our learning journeys were different, I had a unique perspective on it, as opposed to a teacher who didn't have a neurodiversity. And that kept me sort of in that primary field of working with children and teaching. And I was always looking for ways to make learning more dynamic and more interesting, and not always having to record things in the traditional sense. But depending on the schools that I was in, you had to fit in with the system. So although my 9-year-old self wanted to be a teacher, my adult teacher found that I couldn't quite do what I had inspired. So I had to kind of take a different journey.
Why did the particular school head teacher you mentioned say you couldn't tell the students you were also dyslexic? I don't understand why they wouldn't feel that commonality would work.
It's the same as when I was at university, and an English professor told me that I shouldn't be doing the teacher training because I was dyslexic. I think it comes from the awareness. What dyslexia means is obviously it's a literacy difficulty, is its definition. And therefore, for me, my spelling isn't always the best. And my grammar can be, if you're looking at things. So if I'm supposed to be teaching, you have to argue, I guess, from their point of view, that therefore I wasn't going to be able to teach effectively. And that to a degree is true, because yes, I can't always spell things and I might not pick up a grammatical mistake. But even across the board as a primary teacher, I was teaching all the subjects. So you have to relearn things. There are some teachers who literally know everything that they need to know. I was revising as I was going along, and that's what I would do with English. But I would happily tell the children that, let me check that. And I was very fortunate to have the technologies as they were coming out. So I had a spell checker and I had things like that. But I think that's the reasoning, is that it means that I'm not as accurate as some teachers might be. So from both perspectives, the university and one of the schools, I think it's what the perception of it means and what people understand it to mean, I think.
But how's that different to a primary school teacher who's particularly weak at maths, for example?
Absolutely. But I suppose they don't necessarily have to disclose that. It would only be if someone kind of asked them to do an algebra question or saw how far their maths went. Whereas it could be obvious for me if I'd put a spelling incorrectly on the board. Obviously, I was trying not to do that because your role as a teacher is to teach and inform and to show ways of doing things. But I also think it was really important. I mean, I always lacked confidence, and it's the thing that I'm working with my students now to build up. So I understand that aspect of it, that it's not just the academic, it's also the personal feelings of things. But I was really happy to show students that we can't get it right all of the time. And it's not really failing. It's just taking a moment to like proof check, although that's not a dyslexic friendly hand in hand thing because you can't really tell, but you know what I mean? You're trying to check what you've done and have strategies to enable you to move forward. So that's my perspective. So you're right. If you're not great at maths, but you don't have to put that on a CV. If you passed your GCSE, you passed your GCSE and your teacher qualifications. Whereas I've always been proud of my dyslexia, and I know it's difficult for others, but I've always put it on all of the jobs I've gone for because it does impact my ability to communicate or work sometimes. So I felt like it was important to acknowledge that. So so similar, but I obviously had to disclose it. So yeah,
because interestingly, you were saying the point about if you pass a math GCSE, you get to university doing a teaching degree and you get the job. Your English grades must have been good enough to get you onto the teacher training course to then pass it.
Yes.
So, like for like, I totally understand if you're writing spellings on the black or white board, depending on how old you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
That if you're doing stuff wrong in front of the class, that is a problem. But it's also nice for children to see that everybody is not perfect and mistakes happen, but mistakes are not necessarily a bad thing.
Yes.
What tools did you use actually in front of the classroom to help you?
So it's always to do with planning, isn't it? So I would always be using things. And when I first started teaching, that's like 20 years ago. So there was obviously tech. It's remarkable when you start talking to children these days and you're like, well, I didn't have that. But I had like the reading pen when they first came out. I had they used to do little spell checkers. They kind of look like calculators, but they were spell checkers. And So I've had different versions of those because I first had one of those when I was at primary school, but I had that with me. And it was before phones became such a useful device that I had other things, but it was the planning. And obviously general things like spellings that the class had to do, I'd already have those written down and I would be able to copy them. And I only have a little bit of a problem with reversing numbers, but not when I'm working. It's more like when I'm trying to do it for myself. So it was putting those things into practice, making sure that I use technology. So when I was doing my planning, when I was doing preparations, when I was creating things. But as I said, to me, it was important to show children that I have checked this. But if you see something that I've done wrong, or if we're looking at something together, then that's okay. And it's my job, though. I'm the teacher. And it's interesting now because when I was first a teacher, so in a primary school, things like times tables were quite tricky for me because my dyslexia means that the way I process and remember things has always been a little bit more challenging. So times tables used to send me internally into slight panic. But now with the job that I do, I have, and the way that the government is focusing on times tables as don't get me wrong, they are super important.
Yes.
But the way that they are focusing on them and having the tests on them, the students that I'm supporting now require practice all the time. So I do them daily, which means I've actually got them in the forefront of my mind. So when a child goes, but if you're dyslexic, why is it that you can remember? And then I can explain, well, actually, it's because I am doing it every day, but I've also created ways to remember the answers. So I think that's kind of what I was using and explaining right back in the beginning of my teaching career when I was in front of a whole class. And then now it's adapted for me to talk about it more with the students.
Yes. So before we move out of the front of the class job, what would you say the benefits of being dyslexic, teaching children of that age in a sort of standard school classroom?
I think it's a really it gives you two things. It gives you the understanding of what it's like to find learning challenging, because all children are learning all the time, and everybody has different aptitudes for learning and things that they enjoy doing. So I think it gave me that awareness to be more empathetic and more thoughtful in the way that I presented to teach, and made learning more interesting and more fun as a result. I think, obviously, if I could go back and have a word with my 20-year-old self, I'd do even more differently, because when you're a new teacher, you kind of follow the pattern. But the other side of it is the fact that often with dyslexia, you can be more creative, and so you can look at things in a different way. So alongside with the empathy, you have that range of, let's look at these problems differently, or how do we learn so that we can remember and work with these different activities. So it's the understanding of students' learning processes, but also then thinking about how to make learning accessible for all learners, whatever their levels are. So it's not just copying and so on.
Okay. And then you move into Senko, as you mentioned earlier, after you've been frustrated with being in front of the class. Just for people who don't know, what exactly is Senko? What does Senko mean?
Well, Senko is a special educational teacher, and in school it's the coordinator. So often that's a teacher role. It's an additional role within school, like someone who is a deputy head might also be a part-time class teacher, or even a full-time class teacher. In the schools I was in, it was just my role. So I had to train again, and Senkos now, they are almost master's level in their training, which is really good, because it means that their knowledge of a range of special educational needs is really high, but you support all learning needs. And back when I was doing it, I was also in charge of what they used to call the gifted and talented register. So I would have children that were on both, but I would also be looking at transitioning children into school from their nursery when they'd been given a diagnosis, or we knew that there was a need, which meant their learning wasn't in line with age-related expectations, so what the government was saying needs to be done. And at the other end, transitioning them to secondary school. So learners on the autistic spectrum, for example, might have difficulties with change, with moving through different environments because of sound and so on. So my role was to help facilitate them develop an understanding, as well as work with the other educational establishments. So if they were coming from preschool, it's kind of having a dialogue with them and seeing what they've learnt and how we can take that on board. And it would be working individually with students, but also training staff and looking at the logistics of supporting a range of students. So the job of the Senko is multifaceted, but it's in order to help individual learners succeed within the educational environment.
And what methods or strategies do you deploy for that? Are you not limited? Are you guided by government guidelines and higher guidelines, or are you able to apply your own experiences in and devise methods and trial and error it? How do you come about working out what each individual needs?
Yeah, really good questions. It's been a long time now, I'd say, that I've been a Senko in a school. So it's definitely adapted and changed.
Yes, of course.
What I really appreciated when I was the main sort of time period of me being a Senko was when a different government was in, and they were looking at children accessing education and the difficulties they may have, and they created some really great training, and it was really substantial, and it wasn't mandatory, but it was a high level, this is what you should do. So it was really brilliant, because it was looking at all different learning needs and how we should be thinking about how we work with children as teachers. So the language that we use, the way we set up our lessons, the classrooms, how we work with other children. So about inclusion, really. It's kind of when we first heard that word inclusion, that's what it was about. And so it definitely comes from higher up, so government level, and then county level, and then within a school, especially if you're a state school. if you're a private school, obviously things can be run slightly differently. When I was a Senko, I was in state primaries, one small and rural, one much larger, and in a town. And so you have to follow the guidelines. And so what you're looking at is using your training. So in my case, I had like the other side of it because I also had dyslexia. So it was rare to meet at that time anyone else who had a diagnosed need as well as being a Senko. So it did give me that kind of different perspective, but we all had to go and be trained in specific areas in ways that paperwork had to be filled in about the protocol of working with students, are going along the guidelines of diagnosis and levels of support and what that looked like in a school, and where we would have to deploy our training and ways of working. It also meant that within a school at that time, and still is the case, I believe, is that you have like an awareness of the finances, the budgets that go with that, the personal programs for individual children, and where the government are putting money in. So you are in that, like the senior leadership team often, or asked to come in to work through those issues. So you are given your professional judgment. And as I said before, the qualifications to be the coordinator is quite high now. So that does give you professional knowledge, but there is definitely guidelines to work with. So again, that's why I moved away from the role, because I couldn't always facilitate what I felt was best for the individual students because of the system and what was required within a certain establishment.
Do you feel there should be more neurodiverse people, particularly in Senko roles at the school? You touched on that you're probably one of the minority at the time. What time are we talking about?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think it helps. And there are a lot of teachers now who disclose that they are dyslexic. I work for an organisation for dyslexia specifically, and my superiors were also dyslexic. So that really helped. And I think it's important that we promote the importance of using your individual neurodiversity as shining. I noticed from what you say, it's about shining a light on dyslexia, and that's kind of what I'm saying. We need to do that and talk about it from our own point of view and share it. So there are quite a lot of teachers out there who are dyslexic, might not be doing the SEND role specifically, but will use it within their teaching. And I think that's definitely something that should be championed and looked at, because as we said before, even with my journey, whatever your neurodiversity is, it does mean that being in a role like that, where there's lots of finance discussions and things that might not suit your personality, but it's about sharing that empathy and that awareness and what it's like to hear that journey, because you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and that's really hard for anyone to do. But if you've never found learning challenging, then you can't really understand what it's like to find learning challenging, or still find learning challenging. Like I'm very happy to read and learn more things. And, as we discussed earlier, I like learning and finding out about stuff, but you can get overloaded. But it's important to share those kind of things with other people, I think. So yes, definitely. I think people with neurodiversities who are in those professions need to be asked for their opinion, or need to be made to feel confident, if they're not, to take certain roles, because otherwise we will be stuck in not really learning.
Yes, I see your point. And I think it is good, and you do make a good point there, that actually sort of existentially nobody can understand what it's like to be on other people's shoes, particularly if you didn't struggle with learning. And it's the same with other things as well. So talking about struggling to learn, let's go back to when you found out yourself that you were dyslexic. How did that come about?
So like yourself, I was diagnosed relatively early. I was kind of picked up when I was 6, 7, but I got my formal diagnosis when I was 8. So as I said, I was really lucky, because I went to a small private school where the principals had done qualifications. So that was in the 80s. So going back to that time, dyslexia really wasn't something that was talked about a great deal. My parents did get, that's just because you're middle class and your child's lazy. That was something that was talked about often back then. And sometimes even kind of rears its head now and again. But that's I'm very grateful for my parents and the school being able to see it differently. So I, from my own personal perspective, I looked around, if I remember, and felt like I was different from my peers. So I felt like my initial steps into handwriting and recording what I was thinking and trying to get letters around the right way and put down what I was thinking was not good at all. For my job now, I've recently gone back and found, because my mum kept some of my books, and actually it's not as bad as I had like told myself it was, but that's because the bar was set very high in the school that I was in. Mm-hmm. So I felt like I wasn't achieving, and I noticed that. I'm assuming from when I was in reception, so that's when you're like 5 and 6. I always felt like I wasn't where I should be. But as I said, with the school support, we went down the road of assessment, and finding it out was really helpful for me, because I just remember going, so that there's nothing wrong with me. My brain just is a bit different. And in the school I was in my class at one point, there was like 6 of us who had dyslexia. So it was a small school, small classes, and some children parents had found out the school was really supportive in helping children who found learning challenging. And so there were 6 of us. I still remember students going, well, can I catch that? Or, why is it you can't do this? So it wasn't much different to my peers, but I know probably locally at the time, I may not have received the level of support and understanding that I did at the school I was in. Things have obviously changed, not to where I'd like them to be, but that's my learning journey started. So I knew from a young age I received extra support. So I wasn't put in for the 11 plus. I didn't do French at school, and I went and had small group support and worked on different literacy programs and other programs that are still around today that have been sort of modernized. So I was really grateful for that, and I never saw it as being different. I did actually do like French outside of school and different things just to bridge the gap. But I was quite happy with that support. When I went to secondary school, I went to a local secondary, and that was a more interesting journey, because obviously I had been taught that education was important and I wanted to learn. I already had this goal of wanting to be a teacher, so I knew that I had to go on that academic journey. Whereas I was with much bigger classes, loads more students of varying interest levels and abilities and empathy and understanding. And so my secondary journey wasn't as fun for me as my primary one was. But I maintained that focus of knowing that I wanted to move on to be a teacher. So I kind of kept that as the goal through secondary. And the teachers and my parents often had conversations about my level of like what I was able to hand in for homework in comparison to when I answered questions, which is that typical spiky profile of a dyslexic. I could speak it, and I was interested in the lesson, so I was engaged, and then I couldn't hand in the same level of work, or they were writing lots of red lines for spelling and so on, and they just thought I wasn't trying. So even though again that diagnosis was there, it still wasn't completely understood during that time of my of education. And when I said as I was taking my GCSEs, I think I need to do a different academic journey because I really want to stay in learning and I really would like to be a teacher. Again, we had this conversation about adults around you saying, well, I said, I don't want to do A-levels. I'm going to do something else. And my parents had lots of conversations with teachers about, well, she can't make up her own mind and she should be doing this, which I think is interesting. Because I did know my own mind as a dyslexic learner, and I did manage to achieve, and I knew that I wouldn't if I stayed and did A-levels. But I think it shows you the timing of things, because perceptions and understanding of different learning needs have changed over the years. But if I'd listened to their advice, I'm not sure I would have got there as quickly as I did with the training, or I might have even changed my mind because I would have found it tricky. So that's kind of my background.
Okay. So What did you do instead of A-levels?
I went to an FE college and I did a BTEC instead because I knew that taking exams, which is what I still find today with all the students that I work with, taking exams isn't often a dyslexic friendly way of working. And so I knew that I needed something where the sum total of my knowledge wasn't in one test. So the BTEC at the time was the equivalent of doing A-levels because of all the different components of it. Things are slightly different now to when I took mine. But I did psychology and sociology and lots of different things at an A-level level. It just wasn't as much as an A-level would be in like the time scale. And all of the reporting had to be written. And so there was no test and no exam. And I achieved good grades with that, enough to be accepted to a couple of universities. So again, I was really fortunate. I think it was worth the commute that I had to do, and it was worth the decision making, because it definitely gave me more confidence, and made me more aware of different ways of learning and reporting and sharing information, and put me out of my comfort zone, because some of the other things were where you had to use role play more, or you had to go into other settings and share information. And as a quiet child and teenager, it was a new journey for me. So it definitely was better than staying in the same school and just picking three, subjects which I may have been able to be good at, but would have struggled to achieve a 2-year grade in. So yeah, it was kind of that's what I talk about with my students today, is that not everybody does an A to B journey in a straight line, but often if you're neurodiverse, you might find that you take a couple of lanes and go down a hill and then, and up the other side, because you just have to look at what's best for you. And sometimes what you think might work doesn't always work, so you have to adapt and change, and that's okay too. So I was glad of that sort of slight dog leg into education, because back then it was mostly if you're going to university, you stayed and did A-levels. That's not the same today.
No, I mean, I got BTEC too because I didn't do A-levels, but I think the sort of field I went into, it was all right. So
yes, yeah.
Obviously, we talked about support you got in the sort of primary and secondary education. Now you're into university. Did you have to redo your assessment for
yeah. In my lifetime, I've been assessed 5 times. 5? Every time I've still been dyslexic, which is greedy. Ironic. Yeah, it's different now. So again, I think about it because I obviously work with students today. But my parents had to pay for the initial assessment and then one for GCSEs. Okay. And then after that, I had smaller ones. But every time I went to a different academic establishment, they wanted to check. But I mean, obviously, it's to do with when you're assessed at 7, they're looking at the statistical data of children at the same, or your peers.
Yes.
So obviously, when you get to 15 and 16, you're not no one's at the same. Well, not if you're moving forward, no one's at the same age as they were. So I totally get it. I just feel really bad for my parents because it's a lot to pay for assessment.
Yes.
And back then it was the same, and they had to do that. Whereas you don't have to pay for a full assessment now. So yes, I did. I had to be assessed, and different levels of support really. So GCSEs, the assessment allowed me to have the accommodations of extra time, and that was it because of the levels that I came out at. For college, because it was all paper based, it was sometimes I got an extension time wise, so I got maybe a day or 2 extra. And again, that was pretty much it. But the staff did talk to me about being dyslexic and what I might need. And at one point, I was given a little bit of extra support in literacy skills, which was helpful. Didn't really need it in that area. It would have been more to do with how to present and create reports. But what was there, I was always really grateful to receive. But I went to a couple of universities, and again, there was an awareness of the being dyslexic, and one university had a unit specifically for helping dyslexic students. I didn't make full use of that, I suppose, and then I moved to a different university anyway. So then it was more about the general understanding, and I can't remember now. See, I'm trying to pull back. It's a long time for me. Whether if I got any accommodations, because other than the government brought out teacher training tests for us to achieve that level of English and maths that we were talking about before.
Yes.
They wanted to check us before we got qualified. So other than those, and I don't think I was allowed anything extra for those because that was just proving that you were able to teach. I think there was an understanding within the staff, and if I had needed anything, but generally I was able, because it's different when there's deadlines for handing in assignments as opposed to sitting a test. I didn't have to sit many tests.
Okay.
So it kind of worked well for me. So there was an understanding and there was support if I needed it, but in the most part, still a lack of understanding of a dyslexia by some members of staff, I suppose, because you're always having to explain yourself and what it means. And sadly, that's kind of the same today for some, but not all. So it definitely has moved forward.
Yeah. So did you get any of the assistive technology or any of that kind of stuff at the time? Yes,
I think I did get some financial support for that. So yeah, laptops and other things were things that I had, but there were occasionally some money for support with books or other things. So yes, I did reach out for those, and that's definitely something I would highly recommend because, as you know, the technology makes a massive difference.
It helps a lot, yes,
in learning and supporting.
Yes. Okay, so that's kind of got us all the way through university. We spoke about your teaching career, and then
yes,
at some point you go, I don't want to do this teaching thing anymore as in this guise, and you move on to forming your own best educational business. So I think you did touch on it earlier on in the episode, but as we come back to it, what motivated you to move from the kind of in the system to back outside it, so to speak?
So I think, as I said to you before, that there's lots of really good things to say about our educational system and the research that is going in to support all learners and help all learners progress through school and achieve their full potential and their purpose. What's their purpose and what would they like to go on to do? However, I still believe that the system cannot facilitate that to the best of the degree because we're always looking at levels and testing. And to me, that my perception is that that's the ultimate goal, which is kind of what it is, because as you know, you've gone through and you've spoken before about your first jobs and then going on to restart. So you've gone through that experience and your experience of how people supported you or didn't kind of affects what you do. And I think from moving out of the system, I had some personal reasons too that were health related, as well as my main thing being the fact that I had ideas how to support these students. And there were some students that had a range of special educational needs that really couldn't learn within the classroom. Okay. That didn't mean that I wanted to exclude them or the school wanted to exclude them. As we talked about briefly before, inclusion is super important. Yeah. But sometimes that whole, 9 to 3 in a classroom does not suit some learners, and they don't need to necessarily be in a different school, but they need to be accommodated in the school that they're in. And then we have to think of budgets, finances, resources, rooms, things that you might need, adults that you might need to work with. And it's really difficult in the system that we're in to do that individual for all students.
Right, yes. Yes.
And then just in general, taking a step back from the more sort of severe end where there's a great deal of need, learners with dyslexia also find that learning in that straightforward classroom environment doesn't always work. And because of the system, they can't quite get the help that they need. Where they're leveled at, their attainment levels, whether there is support staff in the classroom, those kind of things all affect their learning journey. And what I find is the students I work with, they all want to learn, but they all have self-doubt or worries, feel that they're not good enough, use other labels along that line. And there's no one is to blame for that. And it's definitely not the student. They need their help, but it's because of the system that they're in, that the way that it flows means that they can't access the way they need to, or, the class teacher needs to achieve certain things by the end of the day, the week, the term, the subject that they're teaching. And it moves too fast, or the teacher isn't able to use some technologies, some assistive technologies to help view it in a different way. There's such amazing stuff out there. We know that quite a lot of classrooms have the interactive whiteboards. Teachers are getting more and more tech savvy, and way more than I would be able to. They're creating brilliant things to help children learn, but still there's I've got to this bit and they should be there, or why isn't it they haven't learned that yet? And so that's kind of why I came out of the system, because I couldn't support each individual learner the way that I would like to. So that's not to say that Senkos aren't doing a great job, class teachers, schools, all of that they definitely are. But it's that awareness of those individuals, and sometimes the ordinary schooling isn't the easiest of paths, and sometimes adapting it a little bit can make a big difference, and sometimes it really isn't where a child will thrive. So it's trying to find what works best for them. So that is why I came out of the system, and kind of did take a massive leap of faith, because I had a few parents who were interested, or people near me who were like, could you work with my child? And I couldn't really do that in the time scale of working for the state system. So I kind of went, well, okay, if I've got one or two, if I leave, I wonder if I can get a few more. And I've been really fortunate and really, really privileged to work with such a diverse range of our lovely young people, from being really little is to, taking their GCSEs and having plans for where they'd like to take their lives. And it's been really, 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 really interesting and uplifting to work with them, but also still sad in that sense that sometimes I feel like that understanding of dyslexia and other needs hasn't changed much from when I was their age.
Okay.
And so I have the conversation with them. I do understand. And when I was at school, sadly, that was similar for me. I'd like it to be different for you, but this is what we can do about it. So it's looking at it from a more personal perspective is what I do now.
And obviously you have probably quite a few dyslexic children with you. What other neurodiverse conditions do you look at? Autism, ADHD and all that as well?
Yes, all of the above. Yes, and I as you read out kind of what my business is now, but I literally support any learners who find learning challenging for whatever reason. And some learners will know that they have a label, a diagnosis of something. Sometimes they don't, because it's the parental choice not to share the label. They know they think differently, but that's as far as it may go. Yeah, and I find that often you're talking about more than one need. So yeah, I work with students with dyslexia or dyscalculia, dyspraxic tendencies, with ADHD and on the spectrum. So it's across the board. I tend to support with the academics, but through supporting them, I'm always bringing that message of learning to learn. So I'm sure, like the metacognition idea, how does our brain work? What's the best strategies for us, so that they can feel more self-confident and more self-aware, but because the system requires them to learn things at a certain time, that's what we're working with. So my sort of passion is sort of teaching children to understand themselves, to be more confident. And that kind of is the underlying of my business, whereas the main bit is generally to support with literacy, English and maths, and to support students in understanding how to answer questions with their GCSE. So I'm not a GCSE expert, but I understand how a dyslexic person may struggle to interpret a question, or what is required and how we can break that down into steps. So yeah, I also work with students who can't engage with school. So there might not be a specific neurodiversity, but for some reason they can't engage, and so it's coming out as a behavioural or emotional need. And I look at that side too.
Okay. Yes, I was going to ask actually whether you get students come to you that are having behavioural problems, and you discover it's more a mismanaged neurodiversity that's causing them to get frustrated.
Yeah, definitely. Previously, sort of the students I get now, it's the support that either the schools or local families will mention what I do. But yes, some students. So I work with a couple of students at the moment who are homeschooled, and in the past I've done the same. And often that's because the parents or the children, or both in conversation, have worked out that the school environment just doesn't suit them, and they can't maintain their focus or those kind of things. So it does come out in a behavioural need. And that's the other side of the business that I do. Less recently because of COVID.
Yes.
I haven't really done it. But I used to go into different schools and do schools training. So again, what we touched on before, I kind of always start off, do you want to stand in my shoes? So come here and look at what it's like to be dyslexic, and the activities that I've sort of done throughout the years that I've picked up from other organisations and myself means that I'd get them to like look at something that was in a completely different language, or can you remember what this sign looks like, or and they'd be like, oh, that's really quite challenging, and I'd be like, yeah, so that's what it's like to be dyslexic, neurodiverse, have these kind of things going on. Or think about if I asked you to say sentences without these letters in, or if I keep talking at you while I ask you to write something down, and it's a bit more complicated. They can put themselves slightly into my shoes, a dyslexic person's shoes, and then I talk about the strategies and things, because, as I said, schools are really good at being dyslexic aware. Often there are dyslexic friendly classrooms now. That's a whole movement, and schools can, have achieved certain levels in that kind of thing. So the knowledge is there, but it's really nice to just tweak, I guess, a teacher's understanding of what it might be like, and then to see some amazing things done in schools where they understand that some children can't always sit at desks for long periods of time, or that just writing with a pen on a blank sheet of paper isn't helpful. And it's just those little things that can make massive differences, and that's might come through me, but that's all the training that is there, and it's just putting those ideas together or reminding them of things that they might have done in the past. So that's also a really rewarding part of my job, is connecting with other professionals. And then the other side is working with parents. Before I work with children, I always work with their parents, and there's lots of different emotions that go along with having a child who finds learning challenging. So I want to support them and give them the skills. And as you may know, often if you have dyslexia or a neurodiversity, it's genetic. So it's in the family line. And some parents find out at the same time as they find out with their child, or they suddenly go, well, I found that difficult at school, and they don't have, and they've achieved whatever they've achieved and they're doing their jobs, but they suddenly go, but that's why that's really hard. So it's really valuable to work with all areas, and that's what I really try and maintain. Is it's never just it's not just the child you're working with. I have to have, if possible, dialogue with the school and with the parents, because then we're a team around the child, and it's in making the child aware of their importance and how things can be adapted so that they can achieve.
Okay. So focusing, say we are talking about you're working with a dyslexic child, is there any sort of specific techniques? I mean, you don't have to give away all the secrets, obviously, but what sort of tools and strategies would you typically use? I understand everybody's different, but I just kind of get a flavour for what you would kind of do.
Absolutely. It's really difficult because every learner is different. But I think the first thing I try to tap into is like asking questions, and I use the questionnaires that are sort of generally available on thinking about what sort of learner they are. So it's very contentious at the moment, the VAC kind of learning. Are you visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? Because there's lots of research that say that doesn't matter. There's lots of research that says it does. And I think it's not really how you talk about it, it's how you use it. And I think it's about giving empowerment to the students. So if I say, like when the teacher's talking, do you suddenly like drift off into a daydream or want to fidget? But if they are showing you something, can you remember that kind of points to the fact that they're less of an auditory learner and they need those other things going on, and also about how they communicate what they're asked to do. So if it's always writing, but they find that challenging on different levels, from holding a pen and physically writing, because that can be part of the dyslexia too, to remembering spellings and organizing thoughts and getting the words down. There's lots of different things that you can look at. So it's the skills of how do we need to learn? So if I find out they're quite physically active, but they find times tables difficult, and I know they might have a dreaded trampoline, the thing that takes children to casualty quite often, I get them to jump on there to create a beat for the times tables. Or in school before, we had children using like the paving slabs to mark out each times table. So they were doing it physically and saying it, as opposed to writing it down on a piece of paper. To write stories and get ideas down, I often talk about, it's much harder since I've been taking my lessons on Zoom and I'm not physically with a student. Yeah. We do our best. And there is great technology. I'm not the best at it, but there's things that we've sort of worked with using. But when I was with them, or the skills that I sort of teach, I write things on Post-its. There's a great phrase that is definitely not mine, but it's called a mind dump. You literally get out what's in your head. And I love that, because often we can overthink things or have so many ideas, and it's about helping students get out what's in their head and then think of the next thing. So all the things I talk about is it's making the steps for learning. It's looking at the bigger picture, because often as dyslexics we like to know where we're going and what's expected of us or what we need to do. But then the concern comes from, well, how do I get there? That seems really hard and I'm not sure I've got all the skills. Whereas if you break it down into the steps, and so that would be something like a parent or a teacher might do, actually physically writing them down if a child's able to read, or using pictorial references. And then they can have that sense of achievement when they tick something off, which also means getting homework done, and tasks which may be difficult are then able to be achieved. But you can put time slots and you can help with all of those things. I was just talking on my own sort of Facebook platform about holiday times, for example. So people who are neurodiverse can have anxiety or difficulty dealing with changes in routine. So if it's a half-term holiday, that looks different to what school or college or even work might look like. And then halfway through the holiday, they might realise that they've got to go back to school, the place that is causing them a bit of concern right now, because they don't feel happy about where they are or what's going on. And so it's about kind of putting a visual reference into that, something that is visual to see, and having conversations. So I think the biggest thing that I've learned is to make sure as a professional I'm listening to what they're saying, but also sharing ideas of how you can overcome things. So acknowledging whatever the concern is. But then I was just what's the worst that could happen? Lots of the students I transitioned to secondary that may be on the spectrum would have things like, well, what if I get a detention? What if I forget my homework? What if I do what I always do and I do this? I'd be like, so what's the worst that could happen? And generally it could be a detention, or you'd be a bit late, but then they start to go, well, actually that's not as bad as I thought. And they can then put the strategies in place so that they feel like, well, actually I know that I've got my phone to call my mum, or I talk about organisation, like having different coloured folders for the different lessons that you have, and then maybe having a binder system or something at home so you know where homework goes. It's putting in all these little strategies, and then when something new or different comes along, how can you take a strategy and adapt it? So it's having that dialogue. It's I always talk about your story is your story. So if you know about yourself, your narrative, what you've gone through, even if you're 7 or 8, you know what you enjoy doing and you know what you might find tricky. And then we can find the strategies to help with that. So I always think that going back to your question, because I've been very long-winded about it, but that to help, what you want to do is you want to know what the task is, be able to break it down into smaller parts. And that might not be the learner themselves doing that. That might need some help to start off with. And then finding creative ways that suit their learning styles. So if they're really good at drawing or cartoons, or they don't like writing at length, but they could do speech bubbles, finding smaller strategies where you can put colour in, where you can go over things and make it more creative and more memorable. Because with dyslexia, often the memory is one thing that we find challenging, and that's not necessarily going to change. But it's about creating a hook, I find. When I was younger, they were like, you need to learn mnemonics and you need to do this, but no one really explained their purpose. So I was like, you're giving me more things to remember? I don't understand. You're telling me I've got a memory difficulty and now you're giving me more things. Whereas with my students, I try and say, this might not work for you, but what you want to do is like opening up an onion, isn't it? You want to have those layers. So then you go, that's what works for me and I'm going to try this. So definitely making it practical, definitely making it fun. For younger students, if you can put words in like bottom, or fart. Definitely makes a difference to help with the memory. But anything that's fun or silly helps with the remembering things, and creative and colourful or active. So it's looking at what the learner, however old they are, because that applies for you and I too. Yeah. Whatever our ages are, we're going to gravitate to what suits us best. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer. But creative, fun, interactive is the best way to go. And relearning. So using tech as well, I should add in there, is super important. I'm so grateful for my tablet and for me personally, but also what it gives my students, because there are some great app designers out there that make learning spellings more fun, that make learning times tables more fun. It's looking at ways that suit you. So if you're an auditory learner and like singing and songs, some brilliant teachers have put the times tables to raps and other kind of songs, or songs that are already out in the mainstream. If that works for you, you only have to like search them and you'll find them. But it's about knowing you. So that's my biggest thing to sort of lay out there.
Okay. Yeah. I remember before I started uni, I thought I'd best get better with timetable. And I had this like PC game where you had a dragon and you had to go through and work the timetables quick enough to complete levels, which is just kind of silly.
Yeah, but you've remembered the game and it served its purpose. That's what's great about some of these things today, and they're even better now probably than even when you were doing that.
Yeah.
The graphics have got better.
Yeah. I think these look like a mid-90s PlayStation game, even though it's the mid-2000s. And it wasn't available on a mobile phone either.
No.
So you mentioned about coaching parents as well. What sort of things do you find you need to kind of overcome with parents, and how do you coach them in? Are they on board with you most? I assume they would be, because the fact that they're paying you for a start.
They're seeking help, yeah.
So seeking help, they're already on with the program. But what do you normally have to coach them then?
Yeah, it's that you're right. Generally, where I am now, it's definitely that they're seeking help. So they're already on the first step. So I always say that, that's what makes them really good parents, because they might not feel they have the tools or the understanding or know where to go. But if they're seeking help and looking for answers, then and also talking to school about, the school might say their child is almost where they should be, so they've got no concerns, but the parent is seeing different things at home. Mm-hmm. I think it's acknowledging those things. I have to say, when I worked for a charity where I was supporting dyslexic learners a lot, it was kind of my goal to make a parent cry. Oh, and that sounds really awful, doesn't it? That sounds really awful. But what was happening is that if a parent has been bottling up inside their different feelings, they now have the chance, because someone is saying, I do understand your journey is different to mine, but I do understand, and it will be okay. It might not be okay right now, but it will be okay. And you are on the right path. And I think that is such a relief for parents. So it is what I said, making parents cry. It wasn't really a goal. I'm really a very understanding person, but I could tell that they had been on this journey and they had got stuck in talking to schools, or they didn't know where to turn, and then they'd found someone to talk to about it. And like I said before, sometimes the families themselves knew that they didn't like school, or they found learning challenging, and they may not have any diagnosis, but they don't want that journey for their child. They don't want that experience. So it's looking, again, like with the children, it's looking at the emotional side and supporting them with that. So we all want the best for our children and we want them to succeed. And when you feel that might not be as easy as it is for others, that can be really negative for a parent, because you can put blame on yourself. So there's that in the background, and then there's that I've been talking to the educational establishment, or they're saying there's nothing, and they're in that kind of almost a battle mode, because they're advocating for their child because they know something, or because they're trying to make a challenge, and they don't know necessarily how to articulate. So I know relatively recently, I had a conversation with a parent on Zoom, and she said, I'm talking to you now because I've got the meeting with school. And she said, and I don't feel, and I said, right, okay, so you need to calm down and think about what you're going to say. And it was talking her through trying to release any of the overall emotions that she might have, so that she could listen to the teacher, but then put her case across in a different way. Because I think we all, especially as a parent, you have that initial stage of, I just need to be heard and I just want this to be different. And that doesn't mean that the teacher isn't trying to do that, but there could be reasons why it's not quite what the parent wants to understand. So I'm kind of that middle ground. And that, again, is what I feel really blessed with, having that unique perspective, because I am a teacher. I was a primary school teacher, and I was in a school environment in the private sector and the state sector. So I knew how they run, and I know that. But I also know what it's like to have parents that have a child who's dyslexic, and I also am a dyslexic learner. So it meant that I had that, I can talk to them through that point of view. So it's that emotional journey that they're going on, and also how to help them deal with the emotions of their child. So, you know, because if, like we said before, putting yourself in their shoes, if they don't have any needs and haven't seen anything like this before, and often what happens that I find is you get that the younger sibling is overtaking that slightly older sibling who might have the need. And that's when the observation really comes into play. And they're like, I don't understand, because I thought they were making progress. And it's breaking down those things and talking them through and looking at next steps and how to communicate with school, how to seek the right sort of support. And then again, just like I spoke to you about, the strategies that they can use. They don't have to be teachers to be qualified in understanding their own child. And some simple strategies for organisation can mean the child can be and will be independent, but you have to put the scaffolding in place first. And sometimes that's hard for a parent to understand, because just go and get your shoes or, you know, do these things becomes, if you've got ADHD or dyslexia or something similar, a completely different task entirely. Or you get to the top of the stairs and you think, why was I here? And you do that when you're 7, not when you're, you know, in your 70s. And so it's trying to get them to understand that whatever the need is, there is a definition of what that need might be, but it's more than that. And sometimes it can come across in daily living as well as reading, writing and other things. So strategies to help with that. And then again, just the little things about, right, well, if you're doing times tables, have you thought about doing it this way? You know, I know how busy it is to try and hear them read every day. So have you thought of doing this? And it's putting those tips in and being conscious of what family life is like for them, but enabling them to either seek strategies of their own thinking with their child, or that I can put in place and say, hey, try this. And as I said, I feel my job from my knowledge base is empowering others. So it's allowing them to build up their knowledge and their understanding, and communication is really key. Talking with, you know, you can't talk about a child anymore. You need to include them.
Yeah.
You might not be able to include them in everything, and you might not be able to use the technical language or the specific skills to them, but you can create it so that they understand, and enabling a parent to do that and be part of that growth is really important.
Yes. I think so. And I think you're right. I like the idea it's a holistic approach. You're actually at school, you're at the child's level, you're at the parent. And most importantly, you keep the child engaged with what's going on rather than, yeah, you used to sometimes feel like it was happening around you, then you had to turn up.
Yeah, and done to you. You will go to this lesson and you will take part, but it didn't make any sense because no one explained it correctly, and it doesn't take much sometimes to explain things to learners who have neurodiversity. It's just that if it's not explained, it makes no sense to them.
No, you sort of, why am I pouring all of this effort in to get not great marks for something I don't really understand why we're doing it in the first place.
Yeah. Or enjoy, or no, or I already know what I want to do for a job, even when they're, 7 or 8, and it's like, it doesn't involve this. And you're like, yeah, I know that, but you're within the school system, so why you're here? And you just kind of go along that journey. But it's almost like once it's said out loud, it makes more sense to them, I think. And we sometimes forget that we all do. We assume people understand where we're coming from, or that they understand what we're talking about, and that's not always the case.
Yes. Okay, well, that brings me to near the end of the episode. So I've got some rapid fire questions that I like to ask at the end of every episode. Okay. So they are quick questions from me. They don't necessarily need quick answers from you. So let's go for the first one then. What prejudice had you had about dyslexia that has been proven wrong?
What prejudice? Oh, I don't know. That's a really hard one. But it's just a literacy difficulty, because it's way more than that.
Yes, it is, isn't it? And the more and more episodes I do of this, I discover more and more about it. Okay, so if an alien came down and landed and asked you to describe dyslexia to them, how would you describe it to them?
These are great questions. I would explain that all of our brains work differently, and it's an amazing thing when you see how the brain develops from a young child into an adult. But when you have dyslexia or something different, the pathways don't always connect in the same way. So you see the world and interpret the world slightly different to other people.
I think that's a good description. I enjoyed that. Okay. And the very last question of the podcast, really, and of course, this being called the Dyslexia Life Hack Show, what would you say your favorite dyslexia life hack is?
Oh, the development of devices so that you can ask your phone how to spell something.
Yes.
or even do a calculation.
Yes.
If I can ask it to do it so that I don't even have to type it in. But yeah, so I would say there are so many hacks out there. There's so many brilliant professionals and so many people like yourself that are sharing so many great ideas.
Thank you.
But the advancement in technology has made such a difference. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't teach our children how to handwrite. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't learn how to do mass computation. But when things are tricky and you can use a device to take one of those tricky steps out, it's amazing.
Yes. Steve Jobs has got a lot to be thankful for, hasn't he? I like that a neurodiverse guy managed to design a device that helps lots of neurodiverse people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much for including me on this. I think it's so important, as you said, that people who are neurodiverse share their stories to empower other people, but also to give them life hacks and ways of working. So behind me, not that your people listening will know it, I have a picture of a lighthouse because I have a Facebook group called Lighthouse on Dyslexia. So if there's anyone listening who wants the support for learners going through the education system or who are parents, I'm definitely there as a community, as a private group to share tips and sort of strategies to work through schooling and so forth. And we'd love to have people join in. But if you are dyslexic and you're thinking, I'm a bit nervous to share my skills, go out there and share it because we can empower the next generations to know that everybody is awesome. But if you have a neurodiversity, you definitely see the world differently and you can make a super big difference in the world around you. And so listening to podcasts and visiting places like mine on Lighthouse of Dyslexia is really key to share for the next generations. So that's my slight shameless plug. But Roll It Ed is my information. So people can look me up if they would like to know more. But thank you so much for this platform.
No problem. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on. It's been really interesting hearing, particularly your time as a teacher in the school system and what you did afterwards. And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen to this episode. And I will see you in the next episode. Goodbye for now.